No worries. Hey guys.
Hi, welcome. So this is Monday Mythbusters. This is our premiere version of the Monday Mythbusters, and we welcome you. I'm Dr. Carolyn George of Vita Integrative Medicine, and this is my awesome health coach, Leslie Harrington, and we are going to talk you through the 5 things that you have to know about the flu.
Yes. So bear with us. This is our first premiere, so we're playing around a little bit. We're going to have fun with this. Jump in, ask some questions. We're going to cover a lot of just some of the pressing questions you're hearing about in the news and some of the things that just go along naturally with the flu season that we're seeing all over the place. So
Right. So first thing, the key thing you want to know is, what is the flu? Okay, so flu, we talk about, it's actually influenza. And it's something that's seasonal, as you can tell. It is typified, it's caused by a virus, and typically you have symptoms of a high fever, 103, 104, not unusual. I've seen 105. You get really bad body aches, muscle aches, a bad headache. In fact, one of the key things that I hear people saying that really kind of says, okay, this might be the flu, is when they tell me that their hair aches, that just the hair on the top of their head hurts. So it's really kind of a whole body pain. Then the other things that you'll see will be a lot of upper respiratory things, so sneezing, coughing, runny nose in general, sometimes some nausea. It is not the stomach flu though. It's not when you're like throwing up or have diarrhea. So it's more an upper respiratory kind of body achy type of illness. And so right now we're in the midst of what we call an epidemic. The CDC is warning everybody to get their flu shots. So we wanted to put some information out so people could really understand a little bit about what the flu is, how it's not just a regular cold, it's not the stomach flu, why there's things that you can do, why you would want to do something, and what things you can do for it. Okay? So Leslie, I think, has got a few statistics for us here too.
well, number one, we're going to talk about whether you should get the vaccine or not. So that's kind of, I think, the pressing question. There's a lot of controversy around vaccines. I love that there's no pure thing going on here. There's a lot of like things to consider before you would get the vaccine.
Sure.
So
It's not a black and white issue.
yeah, so maybe talk about why when people, you hear on the streets, I never get a vaccine or I get a vaccine, and coming from the pharmaceutical industry, I mean, I worked in it for 15 years. I never had a vaccine. And it was like kind of 50-50 shot, did I get it, did I not get it, and then everyone in my industry may or may not, they'd be like, oh, you have to get the vaccine. And so what's your opinion on that?
So I think it really depends. So it depends on your risk in the first place. So are you somebody that's out in the world? Are you exposed to a lot of people with potentially the flu, like an airline flight attendant or pilot? Are you a teacher? Are you a doctor? So if you're interacting with a lot of people, then your exposure is higher versus somebody that stays at home. So we've got to look at your exposure, and then we've got to look at your risk should you get the flu. Many people get the flu and feel lousy for a week or 10 days, and then they recover. But some people are much more prone to the secondary infections that can kill. Rarely, but it's possible rarely, but the flu can kill you just because of the flu. It can cause a pulmonary infection and you can die pretty quickly. But that's not the most common thing. Usually what we see is people getting secondary infections. So you've got the flu and then you get pneumonia. You've got the flu and then you get dehydrated. And so those are the things that can kill people. So if you're in a high-risk group where this might be an issue, then you want to think about that. So these high-risk groups would be, are you diabetic? Do you have heart disease? Do you have COPD or cystic fibrosis, other lung issues? Are you on prednisone or any immunosuppressants like Humira, Remicade, that type of thing? So you want to look kind of at your overview risk, and if you have a higher risk, and particularly a higher risk and a higher exposure, then the answer is yes. Flu vaccine is helpful, even in these years where, like this year, we have only about a 10% responsiveness. That 10% can make it or break it in terms of your survival. But if you have no high risk factors and you have low exposure, then you can decide, yes, you want it or not. So those are the kind of things you want to think about when you're deciding what you want to do for yourself.
Yeah, it's funny because that, I talk about being in the industry and then also being a caretaker. So when it came to my father, they were like, he's got to get his flu vaccine, and my sister and I are kind of like, does he? Like, does he not? Like, did we do it? Did we not? Because of, some of the questions around vaccine and whether or not it's safe and things like that. So we did question that, not knowing, because for ourselves, we didn't have a habit of doing vaccine, but being that he was so high risk, he was diabetic, he was overweight, he was a senior, he kind of had all of those things.
Risk factors.
Yeah, the risk factors. So I think it's interesting for people who are in that position where they're taking care of an elder to know there's a difference between their need for it versus maybe your own, or, like a teenager.
Right, and that's a good point. If you are taking care of somebody that's in those high-risk groups, then you may want to really consider getting that vaccine yourself, because you certainly don't want to be the one bringing that disease to them and then ultimately them succumbing from that. So that's a key issue. Other things you want to think about is if you have an egg allergy, for example, then it's made out of eggs. So if it's just a simple like a hive, it's not a big deal. But if you have any other major egg reaction, you shouldn't get it, because there's potential for you to react to the vaccine. And a lot of people worry about the mercury that's in it. And there's only a version of mercury which is called thimerosal in some of the flu vaccines. If you get a single dose vial, they don't have to put any preservative in that, and so there's no thimerosal, so you can always ask for that.
Yeah, they do make those. I remember those were the
Right.
more requested for the kids and things like that.
Yeah.
So, like we talked about the exposure, so the teachers, children, the stewardesses, the people who work from home are probably going to be a little more safe and protected. But moving on to number 2, we covered the mercury, and then we had some questions about Tamiflu, so I know we're going to bring that up here. And in number 2, we're talking about the effectiveness, really. So, or actually we touched on that a little bit here. It, like you said, the 10%, that kind of varies year to year. So what's interesting about
That's
that...
with the flu vaccine, though, not Tamiflu.
The flu vaccine, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure. So this year, in general, they're saying it's been about 10% effective. And there's kind of some dynamics that the public, I don't think, understands, like, oh, why get the vaccine if it's not effective? And in last year, it could have been 50% effective, so it's almost impossible to perfectly predict what's going to happen in the season, as well as sometimes you'll get in a season and you'll have, where you can't get flu vaccines because they're out of them because so many people got the vaccine, and that's just a matter of how they produce it in order to supply it to the industry. So right now you'll hear, oh, the pharmacies have plenty of this, or the Tamiflu's got plenty of this. There was a couple of years where we had no Tamiflu. And then there was where everyone was buying out all the simple syrup to make the cherry flavor, for the kids. They had to compound it to make it a liquid. So I found that really interesting, because the government kind of dictates and mandates, how much is actually made.
Right.
But number 2 is the exposure. So, how can you protect yourself? So what are some of the things that would make it... Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, let's just say a little bit about Tamiflu.
Yes.
So Tamiflu is one of the medications that you can use if you have the flu, but it can only be used, it's only useful if you get on it, if you start on it within 48 hours of developing the fever. So that might be a reason why you see your doctor. So normally for a cold, you wouldn't go see your doctor. But if you feel that you've got something that kind of matches what I talked about, the high fever, the body aches, the headache, the hair hurts, you're feeling miserable, then it's useful to go see your doctor to see if they think you might have the flu. They can do a test for it. But it's also okay to be treated just on the basis of symptoms, because often the test for the flu is not a very precise test. So if it's negative, you don't necessarily not have the flu. But if it's positive, if you shows you have the flu, you really have it. But its predictive value when it's negative, you could still have the flu. So as a doctor, I'll often give people the flu medicine, the Tamiflu, just based on their clinical picture. So Tamiflu, again, has to be started within that 48-hour window. 72 hours is the very longest that you want to wait. And that gives you the benefit of approximately a day or two, sometimes longer if you started it right off, but in general a day or two of benefit. So if you take no medicine, the flu will last between 10 and 12 days. You might have the fever 8 to 10 days, which is very different from your 24-hour flu. So with the Tamiflu, instead of 8 or 10 days, it might be 7 or 8 days. It could be a little shorter. But we are seeing with people, especially people that have those risk factors, that it can help to prevent them from worsening so they don't need to go to the hospital. So if you're just looking to get back to work tomorrow, this is not going to work for you, because it's still going to take several days for that to take effect. And you may not go to work until you've been fever-free for 24 hours. And that's without Advil or Tylenol or anything as a fever reducer. So it's not a magic pill, but it can certainly help shorten the course of your flu as long as you're realistic about what it's going to do. The other thing Tamiflu can do, you can take it, say you've got a partner that's got the flu and they're taking the Tamiflu, and you take it twice a day for 5 days. You're living in the same home and you don't want to get what they've got, right? You don't want to share that. And so you can go on Tamiflu once a day, and you can take that for 10 days and try to prevent the flu. So that helps you when you've got that risk to prophylax or prevent you from getting the flu. So those are kind of the two uses for Tamiflu.
Is it also, does it kind of minimize the intensity of the symptoms? Does it help with that, or just more the duration?
It can help a little bit with the intensity, but it's really more the duration of the flu. So you're still going to feel lousy for several days. So people will come, I've got to go to work tomorrow. Well, it's not going to happen, right? Whatever you had planned is now off the planning block.
So going into number 2, the second question was, what makes you the most vulnerable? Mm-hmm. So we talked a little bit about the exposure in your career and how you spend your days, but more going into the holidays and what are some of the other things that kind of lead you into flu season with a higher risk?
Sure. Well, for any infection, virus, bacterial, if your immune system is weakened, you are going to be much more susceptible to this. So the things that you can do to make your body stronger are going to always help prevent any infection, whether it's the flu, a cold, anything that you might pick up. So those are kind of your basics, right? And that's functional medicine. We talk about those basics. So making sure you're getting plenty of sleep, number 1, that's when your body heals and regenerates. So trying to get that 7 or 8 consistent hours a night. If you feel something coming on, often getting a few nights of good sleep, your body can fight it. So sleep, number 1. And that's something that we really give up a lot of over the holidays. So a lot of people get much sicker post-holiday because they really have not been doing that self-care over the holidays. They've been out
food and
the food and partying and the rest of that. So food is the other thing. So making sure you're eating a very plant-dense, nutritious diet with lots of proteins, whether they're plant proteins or animal proteins, but getting those nutrients in there so your body is able to make antibodies and fight off any infection that you might be starting. Many times we start with something and we don't even know it, but our body's madly working to fight it off. And when we give it all the building blocks, we don't even know that we're fighting it off. But when we don't give it the building blocks, we find out pretty quickly. So sleep and nutrition are the 2 top things. But of course, other things kind of factor in. Staying hydrated is important. Making sure you're getting your exercise and your stress management, because when we're stressed, even though that's we think of that as a mental thing, it actually affects us physiologically and affects our immune system. We know that. And so working on those areas are still important throughout the holidays and post-holiday period. But when you're working out, make sure you wipe off your gym equipment before you use it, and then again after you use it.
Well, and I find here right now, because in Florida, it's freezing for us, it's harder to drink. You've got to really be proactive about hydrating, because we're used to it being hot and being prompted and thirsty and things like that. And I'm finding it's harder to kind of keep that high hydration going.
Yeah, you got to just have your bottles of water, and not plastic, but your metal or glass bottles of water, and keep it going.
So going back to the statistics, we're kind of diving into, you do hear a lot of stuff on the news, and there's this, the word, the epidemic, right? The flu epidemic. And they do point out that it's considered to be a high-risk epidemic, flu epidemic for this season. It's just, I think it's important to put in perspective some of the things you see on the news, but I think it's important also to take it very seriously. So I think that they present the information so that we as a society do take it seriously, and we don't take the symptoms lightly. We respond quickly when it happens. But right now we're kind of in the middle of season, so it's not really accurate what's happening in terms of death toll for adults. But what we're seeing and you're hearing a lot about is the children's deaths. So there's been 30 so far for this season.
Right.
And to put that in perspective, last season there was 110. So even if they had tripled, in the next few months left of season, technically we're still below what we've seen historically. So it's still an appalling number. It's still a horrible, traumatic thing. But just to put things in perspective, that when you're hearing stuff on the news, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the worst thing that's ever happened, in the world. It's kind of been going on when you start to look at the trends. We just don't hear about it regularly or look at it from that snapshot.
Well, and the key thing to remember that pretty much every year, even if you look at what the CDC says, they say every year it's an epidemic. So it is a constant threat to our health, but this year it's the H3N2, and that one is a type of virus that's particularly virulent, and we see a lot of illness with it, so that's why they're really worried about having high death tolls, and so they're really trying hard to get people to pay attention to not only do the vaccines, but wash hands and, cover your mouth when you cough and that kind of thing, so we're not spreading it. But in terms of overall prevalence, like Leslie said, we've been looking for an adult death toll, but haven't really seen any significant numbers lately, but I think that's because the numbers kind of drag along. It takes a while for everything to get reported. But the children, the 30 deaths that we've seen so far, of course, appalling. Every death that there is terrible. But it does not look so far from what we're seeing with the data like it's much worse than previous years that we've seen. Now, last year, we did have a really good vaccine with a good match. I think it was about 60%. And so we saw a lot less in terms of illness and hospitalization. Yeah, so any other questions coming up?
Not so much specific on here. I wanted to go back to kind of the, we talked about sleep, we talked a little bit about stress, and we're going to go a little bit more into what to do to keep the body strong, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. There might be some, aside from food and things like that, people pump themselves with vitamin C and echinacea, and they always ask for like that one little remedy that you could possibly give, But to go into kind of the next one, the number 4 question was when to go to the doctor. Mm-hmm. So we touched a little bit on the Tamiflu, what that timing looks like. When do you actually, you wrote a book on the dorm doctor, right? When the kids are in school and they're in college. I know in college myself, I didn't go to the doctor, and I ended up with bronchial pneumonia and this whole, post-flu thing. Right. So going into like, when would you say like go out the door? So
for healthy adults, if you don't have any immunocompromising illnesses such as diabetes, COPD, on steroids, that kind of thing, if you're feeling really, really sick and you've got that high fever, then it's worthwhile to go in to get checked, because if you do have it, you can be treated. If you wait that 4th or 5th day because you just, it's going to stop tomorrow, I'm going to be better tomorrow, then you've lost that window. But if you are sick but not feeling like you're on death's door, you don't necessarily need to go, because you may not have the flu. It may just be some other upper respiratory virus. And so then you don't really need to spend some hours sitting in the doctor's office or the ER. However, if you have any of those things that we talked about that make you at higher risk, then always going in quickly to be assessed to see what it is. Also, if you have children and they have any immunocompromising illnesses like diabetes, we're seeing a lot of children's diabetes nowadays, or arthritis, and they're on Humira, etc., IBD, Crohn's, those kids need to be watched really closely and have a very low threshold for going to the hospital. If they are off their food and they're really lethargic, then that's a big sign, no matter what else is going on. Anytime their attitude like that, their playfulness and their diet stops, then you're worried. So then you bring them on into the physician faster than we would generally with adults. If you're somebody that's not going to use Tamiflu anyways, then it's no big deal. Yeah. Tough it out. Most of the time you're going to be fine, but please do not go back to work. Please do not go to the grocery store. Please do not expose other people to this. Do not fly. I cannot tell you how many people want me to tell them that it's okay for them to fly when they're in the midst of this influenza. And all they're going to do is give it to the 200 people on the plane. And I say, no, you may not. So they're often pretty unhappy. So don't expose other people. Be responsible.
One of the things we've been talking about when we've talked about the flu leading up to this was the distinction. Okay, so I used to, have you ever said, oh, I feel like I might have a little bit of the flu?
Mm-hmm.
There's no little bit of the flu.
Right.
I've learned that it's the wall hitting. I think you described as there's not like you might have it or you don't. It's
Right.
very clear based on
You
what you're
usually
saying.
have a pretty good idea. A cold, you got sniffles. Oh, I think I'm getting something. My throat's a little sore. I'm not sure. What should I do? The flu, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. Boom, you hit the wall. It's like a truck hit you. It's like, I don't know what happened. All of a sudden I feel awful. I'm achy, I'm getting the chills, I feel a little nauseous, my nose is running. That's much more likely to be the flu, okay? So that is a really big distinction. You don't kind of crawl into it. It doesn't happen over a few days. It is a pretty abrupt thing, and you pretty much know it when you see it, when you feel it.
The other thing,
hey Blair.
the other thing, like you saying, it hits you. We talked a little bit about how sometimes it's the stomach bug, and sometimes it's every season's kind of different based on what we're faced with in terms of what the bug is or the strain or whatever it is. So, sometimes the 24-hour flu and whatever. This season, it's all more sinus and upper respiratory that we're dealing
with. Yeah, exactly. And within 24 hours that it's not going away. So if you give it 24 hours and you still feel like you're a ball of doo-doo, then it's time to go in and see if that's what it really is or not.
Yeah. Okay. So number 5, guys, we are going to talk about what it takes to keep the body strong, right? So this is kind of the essence of functional medicine and how to integrate your lifestyle practices to kind of keep your head above water to prevent really the exposure and the risk.
Right.
If you're not that high risk person and you want to just kind of keep yourself protected and be one of the people that survive flu season and go on to the next season saying I never get a flu shot and I never get the flu.
Right.
So I'll start off with the key is going to be obviously nutrition. The more vitamins and nutrients that you can get from the food that you're putting in, so really plant dense, plenty of protein, lean meats, your healthy fats, your hydration, fruits and vegetables with a lot of vitamin C, antioxidants. Sleep, we talked a lot about sleep being critical, and stress. So managing that stress, the stress, anything you can do that, stress can be a trigger for any situation in your body, period, but this is going to be something with the flu that it's going to light the fire.
Right, exactly. And there is some data that vitamin D might be helpful. They haven't studied it in influenza per se, but they did a meta-analysis. The British Medical Journal did a meta-analysis and looked at upper respiratory viruses, and people that had very low vitamin Ds, less than 25 nanomoles, were much more likely to have the flu, to have the upper respiratory illness than people that had higher vitamin D levels. So getting it from the sun obviously is the best, but if you can't, then supplementing it with a capsule. There's a few foods that have vitamin D, so your deep water oily fish are really good for vitamin D. Mushrooms have vitamin D2 in them. Some eggs are supplemented with it, some milk is, but generally that supplement isn't very much, and so you're really looking at more sun.
It's kind of that small ratio compared to the sun.
So more sun or a supplement generally.
Yeah, and then, when talking about exercise, there's always that fine line too. So assuming there's no sickness apparent at this point, exercise is going to be great. But if you're in that setting where in your group setting, you are putting yourself to the people that show up even when they don't feel good. So making sure to clean the machines and kind of keep yourself in a position that you're sanitizing, or cleaning yourself up. Which, by the way, the sanitizers are going away in 2018. So
right. Well, yeah. Don't use one with the triclosan, but you can use other ones. There's other ones that are coming out now too.
So they're just going to reformulate. That are going to accommodate the new laws.
Yeah.
So your normal, traditional hand sanitizers. For those of you that don't know, 2018 they will be banned, and they'll be making formulations, and then good old soap and water.
Yeah. Soap and water is the best. Absolutely. So somebody asked, what is our thoughts about the organic whole food vitamin D sprays? So those can be useful. I think the key is you really want to make sure that you're absorbing it, and so if you prefer the spray over the liquid or the capsule, that can work too. Yeah, absolutely. And there are some people, I think this is more anecdotal, I don't know that there's been any big studies, but there's some people that really find that it improves their immune system, and they feel much better when they do a few sprays when they're starting to feel like they're kind of maybe starting to pick something up. So I think that's fine.
Okay. You guys have any more questions? You don't often get to have a doctor answering your particular flu questions.
Yeah, and by the way, while we're waiting for other questions, this is something that we want to do every week. We're going to call it the Monday Mythbusters. So some Mondays it's going to be more myth and less busting, but we'll talk to you about a variety of different topics. So please send in things that you're interested in hearing us talk about. We'll probably do some talks on SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. We'll do some talks on anxiety. We'll do some talks on the thyroid, which is a key issue. So there's lots of different topics to talk about, but tune in every Monday night at 7:30 for a half an hour, and we'll be here to answer all your questions.
Yes, and Blair asked, so bottom line, be healthy, but still sometimes you'll get pretty sick. Well, yeah, I guess there's no foolproof way that, anybody's ever going to be purely not exposed. But essentially, there's a lot of ways that you can come in with a strong immune system into flu season and be one of those people that really just never get hit by it.
Or if you get hit, it's a milder disease.
Yeah, your body can handle it a little bit better when you're implementing some of these strategies. And then also the people that are in those high risk and they're teachers and their kids are in school and they come home and it circulates the whole family.
Right.
You hear about that all of the time. So having some of these techniques to put into place to help you through that time and or to prevent that from happening at all, would be ideal. So
exactly, yes. Yeah, and you can have it more than once. You can have it twice. You can get A, you can get B, you can get all kinds of different versions. So there's lots out there.
Yeah, it's really interesting because coming from the pharmaceutical industry, years and years, every year they prepare for when this was going on, and the distribution companies and the pharmacies and that buy direct are stocking for flu season, and they base it on the predictions and the history, but every year it's a different strain. So the government's only catching up, and the lots are only produced as they're seeing what they're seeing from Australia is where they're kind of looking for some of the predictions.
Because Australia is having their winter when we're having our summer, so they create the stock based on what's most prevalent in Australia. So if the people from Australia come visit us and bring it to us, thank you very much, then we have their strain. But sometimes it's somebody from Asia or Europe that comes over and has a lot of connections and passes it around. So it really is very difficult. The CDC has a very tough job to try to predict exactly what's going to go on. They don't have that magic crystal ball to really know what the future holds. But they are always trying to improve that and match it better. But
well, and this year, the effectiveness is proving to only be 10%. Last year it was more like 50, but there was still a high toll of deaths last year. So you got to kind of put it all into perspective and understand that there's no real pure way of predicting these things. And it was funny because at the end of every season, it would be like we were either scrapping and everyone's like, we need vaccine, it's crazy, and no Tamiflu and blah, blah, blah. Or it was like, I got like 10,000 extra, doses. Let me give, so we're selling it to each other at that point because there's nothing to do with it when it's done. At the end of the season, it gets destroyed. It's not good for, further use. Year. So it's a really pretty interesting dynamic. So
anyways,
thank you guys for coming out, and we will definitely put some feedback, out. That any feedback that you have is great, and we're going to come up with different topics. So suggestions. Feel free to throw out some suggestions. There's tons of stuff that we're going to cover over the next, so far, week to week on Monday nights. So anything you're confused about,
then let us know. We'll try to clear it up.
Have a wonderful evening.
Have a great evening. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.